basically three things today. One is I want to give you a glimpse into the story of two ordinary people who lived extraordinary lives during the most tumultuous period in history. Second, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story behind the story, how I discovered it, wrote it, and then finally, you can ask me afterward any questions that you have about the story behind the story, about me, about how it was written. No holds barred. I've had a number of very unusual questions. I've probably done this presentation 100 times since the release of the book last year. And I'll tell you about just two of the unusual questions I've got. At one event, and usually there's a book signing after these events, a woman came up to have her book signed, and she said to me, "Could you write something saucy in my book?" And I said, "What you have in mind?" She said, "Thank you for that wonderful evening that we spent together." And so I happened to glance down at her hand, and she had a wedding band on. And I said, "Are you married?" She said, "Oh, yeah." And I said, "Does your husband own any guns or anything?" She said, "No, I don't think so." I said, "Oh, okay, I'll write that in the book." And then at a presentation that I had out in Ohio, there was a teacher in the audience, and she had already read the book. And she said to me, "I really enjoyed your book. When you were a student, were you an exceptionally good student? Did you have extraordinary writing skills?" And I said, "Look, I don't want to sound immodest, but I was valedictorian and class president. Now, I was homeschooled, so I had a bit of an advantage." A letter that was written in 1944 uncovered the true story of Helen Gregg, one of 8 children of Irish immigrant parents raised in the miseries of Hell's Kitchen during the Great Depression, and Clarence R. Stevenson, a young man raised in the dying industrial city of Ironton, Ohio. They both grew up desperately poor, but you would have never known it because they always had an optimistic outlook and a deep religious faith. Helen suffered not only the poverty in which she was raised, but a father who was locked away due to mental illness, a sister who had to go into hiding because of domestic abuse, and 4 brothers who went off to fight in World War II. Life wasn't any easier for young Clarence growing up in Ironton, Ohio. During the Great Depression, the unemployment rate in Ironton was 40%. That's young Clarence standing on the porch of his home in Ironton, a house that his father, who was a carpenter, built with his own 2 hands. During the depths of the Depression, they had to abandon this house for a year and a half. There was just no carpentry work to be had in Ironton. So his father gathered up him, his 2 sisters, and his wife, and moved around the state of Ohio for a year and a half, just to find enough work to be able to feed his family. And as if that wasn't bad enough, in 1937, the Ohio River went over its banks and flooded just about the entire city of Ironton. The Stevenson home had 3.5 feet of water in the first floor of the house. For 3 weeks, the family had to live on the 2nd floor of that house. And it was during January and it was cold. In order to warm up once in a while on a sunny day, the children would climb out an attic window and sit on the roof in the sun so that they could warm up a little bit. I mentioned before that Clarence's father was a carpenter. He took apart his workbench and some other scrap wood, and he built a little rowboat. And he lowered himself out of a bedroom window into that rowboat and would paddle to the only store that was open in Ironton so that he could get a little bit of food and buttermilk for his family. Clarence was inspired after the bombing of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941 to join the Army Air Corps. And his training brought him to New York City in the summer of 1942, where Helen and the aspiring young aviator literally ran into each other in Central Park one day. And from the moment their eyes met, they knew their lives would never be the same.
Pardon me.
Sure.
You're calling Raymond Chris.
Yes. day in Central Park. And from the moment their eyes met, they knew their lives would never be the same. Not caring for the name Clarence, Helen called him by his middle name, Raymond. You knew I'd get to that eventually. They were very different backgrounds and disparate faiths, but no conflicts or differences, or so they thought, would ever keep them apart. In August of 1942, Raymond received orders to return to his home base in Ohio. But before he left, he asked Helen to marry him. She initially said no. You see, she was just 16 years old, and her mother forbid her to marry until she was 18. More than a year later, September 6, 1943, became the happiest day of Helen's life. It was her 18th birthday, and the day she married Raymond. After their marriage in Ohio, Raymond moved about the country training to pilot the B-17, America's flying fortress. Helen followed him by bus and train all across America so that they could be together before he went off to war. And that was a pretty daunting task for an 18-year-old girl who had never been outside of New York City. Raymond's greatest challenges came in combat as a B-17 pilot and flight commander. He had a number of very harrowing missions for which he was awarded several Air Service medals, 2 Distinguished Flying Crosses, and 2 Purple Hearts. Exactly 1 year after Helen and Raymond married, his B-17 went down in a fiery crash, killing him and almost his entire crew. A day that just 1 year earlier marked the happiest of Helen's life was now marred by his death and her despair. Just 6 weeks before her Raymond died, Helen gave birth to a beautiful baby girl she named Anne Marie, a little girl who would never see her father. Helen wouldn't have any sense of closure about her husband's death for another 4 years. It wasn't until 4 years after Raymond died that his body was finally returned to Helen so that she could bring him to his final resting place, a beautiful little cemetery in Ironton, Ohio. Helen thought that he would want to be back in the little city that he grew up in and loved. 9 years after Raymond's death, Helen found love again. She married another soldier, this one a combat veteran of the Korean War, and together they had 3 sons. 61 years after that fateful day when Raymond died, Helen's family gathered to celebrate her 80th birthday. And in the course of the day, she pulled one of her sons aside and asked him for help with something. That son happened to be me. We went into my mom's bedroom, sat down on the edge of her bed, and she reached into the bottom of the dresser drawer, pulled out an old wooden box. And out of this wooden box, she pulled out an old envelope and letter and handed it to me. And she asked me to read it to her. My mom had macular degeneration and couldn't read small print anymore. Hang on, that's me. I always tell everybody in advance, make sure you turn off your phones and other communication devices. So she handed me the letter and asked me to read it to her. And I looked at the envelope, and I saw that the return address said First Lieutenant C.R. Stevenson, Air Corps, a name that really wasn't familiar to me at all. And the date postmarked on the envelope was September 6, 1944. It was my mom's 19th birthday, her and Raymond's first wedding anniversary, and the day that he died. This was the last letter that he ever wrote. My dearest darling, begins the letter. And it was 100 times, and I still struggle to get through it. My dearest darling, begins the letter. And in this letter, Raymond professes his love for his wife, his desire to see his daughter for the first time, and a promise to be home soon. He was about to go off on the third of his final 3 missions. After reading the letter, my mom and I were sitting on the edge of the bed still, both of us with tears running down our cheeks. And a lot of this was a mystery to me. And I said to my mom, I said, Mom, why did you ask me to read this letter to you? Why didn't you ask Anne-Marie, my sister, their daughter, or one of my other brothers to read the letter to you? And my mom said, I have a story to tell you, but you got to keep this just between you and me. All right, so this is just for this room. This doesn't go beyond these doors, okay? She said, when I was pregnant with you, I said to your father, if I have a boy, what do you think about the name Raymond? And my father said, oh, you want to name him after my Uncle Ray, who my father was very close with. And my mom said, sure. She said, you're not named after Pop's Uncle Ray. I wanted to name you Raymond after my Raymond. So there I was at my mom's 80th birthday party. I was 50 years old at the time. And learning that I'm the namesake for this dashing and brave young aviator who gave his life for his country in World War II. My mom and I didn't talk a whole lot about this story after that day. But a few years later, my father passed away. And my mom and I started talking more about her earlier life, about her time growing up, and the very brief time that she had with Raymond. And the more I learned about this story, the better the story got. So at the age of 56, I was the president and CEO of a bank. And I decided to quit my job in order to write this story. Now, when I got home from work the day that I made this decision, my wife and I did not have the usual, how was your day at the office talk. So I told her what I wanted to do. And she said, you know, I'm very supportive, and if this is what you got your heart set on, it's okay with me. She said, but I gotta ask you something. Are you having a midlife crisis? And I said, no, I don't think I'm having a midlife crisis. But what I do have is a sense of urgency. You see, anyone who was witness to the accounts of this story had to be in their 80s and 90s. And if they should die, what stories, letters, photographs, documents might be lost forever? In my search to uncover the entire story, I met more extraordinary people and had more surprises than I can count. And I'd like to tell you about a few of those people and surprises. In this photograph, in the back row, excuse me while I ditch this. In this photograph in the back row, the tallest gentleman in the center, that's Gunnery Sergeant Keith Clinton. Mr. Clinton is the only living member of this B-17 crew. And about 4 years ago, I set out to find him. And I wasn't even sure at that point if he was still alive. On a Wednesday afternoon, I'll never forget it, I thought I had tracked down the right Keith Clinton. And by the way, there's a lot of Keith Clintons in the United States, I've come to find out. But I thought I found the right guy. I picked up the phone, dialed the number, and this old gravelly voice answers. So at least I think I got a guy who's in the right age group. He says, hello. I said, hi, is this Mr. Keith Clinton? Yep, who's this? I said, Mr. Clinton, my name's Ray O'Connor. You don't know me, we've never met. But my mother is the widow of your pilot and flight commander, Clarence Raymond Stevenson. He says, no kidding. How Mom's Helen doing? I said, my mom's doing just fine, sir. How are you? He said, well, I'm 89 years old. I'm still above dirt. That's pretty good. I said, Mr. Clinton, I don't want to be a pest, but I'm working on a project. Do you think if I was to come out to your home in Michigan, that you might have some time to speak with me? And if you've got any photographs, records, letters of any kind, be willing to share those with me. Oh, what are you doing next Saturday, Ray? I said, I think of getting on a plane and coming out to Michigan, which is what I did. And I spent the better part of the day sitting at Mr. Clinton's kitchen table with his wife and his two daughters. And he told wonderful stories about his experience in the war, about his crew, about the men who weren't just crewmates with him, but guys that he loved like brothers. And even though 70 years had gone by since he had been on that B-17 with that crew, tears still welled in his eyes, and he still struggled to tell the story about how most of them met their demise. One other thing, one other surprise that Mr. Clinton had for me, by the way, was he had the original handwritten flight records of all their missions. A real gift in terms of putting together this story. I made similar phone calls to the two women in this photograph. That's Raymond when he was an Air Corps cadet in 1942. And to your left is his youngest of two younger sisters, Ruth. And to your right is his other sister, Marjorie, holding on to Pete, his dog. I made the first call to Ruth. And she said, you know, Raymond, I'd be happy to speak with you, but I don't have any photographs or records of any kind. When our parents passed away, my sister Marjorie took all that stuff with her. But I went out to her home in Akron, Ohio, and we sat around her house for the better part of the day. And she told beautiful stories about her family, about Raymond, about them growing up, about how she learned of his death during the war. And there were more than a few tears shed that day. And as our conversation was wrapping up late in the day, she said to me, Raymond, I told you on the phone, I didn't have any photographs or any records of any kind. But I found something down in my basement the other day that you're welcome to take with you. And I said, great. I said, what's that? That's Raymond's diary. A diary. When I got back to my hotel room that night, although it was a little bit after my mom's bedtime, I called my mom, and I called my sister Anne Marie, and I said, did you know that Raymond kept a diary? No. Nobody knew he kept a diary. He started this diary on the day he decided he wanted to be a pilot. And he wrote about hopping on a bus and going to Dayton to join the Air Corps. He recounted his diary the day that he met and fell in love with Helen, my mom, and so many other cherished memories. And this just wasn't a precious gift for me in terms of writing the story, because one of the things that I couldn't find out was, what did this guy think? My mom, his sisters, other family members, a crew member could tell me about him. They could tell me what they thought ran through his mind. But I figured I'd never know. And then the diary shows up. And not only was this a precious gift for me, but an even greater gift for my mother and my sister, his widow and daughter. On my way to Springfield, Ohio, to visit Raymond's other sister, Marjorie, and her family, I got to thinking to myself, will anybody besides me think this is a good story? And on my way to Marjorie's home, I stopped in a little flower shop in Springfield, and it was just before Valentine's Day, and the flower store was just buzzing with activity. Valentine's Day, busiest day of the year for flower shops. So I go to the counter, and a woman comes up and says to me, do you need roses for Valentine's Day? And I said, no. I said, what I'd like is a really bright, beautiful bouquet of fresh spring flowers. So she comes back with this gorgeous bouquet and says to me, these flowers must be for a special woman. And I said, these flowers are for a 90-year-old woman I've never met. said, there's got to be a story behind that. I said, there sure as hell is. She said, is it a good story? I said, how about I let you be the judge? She said, it's okay. So I started telling her the story about Helen and Raymond and why I was in Springfield, Ohio. And as I told the story, I could see one by one, each of the workers in the shop stop what they were doing. And they were listening too. And so were the other customers in the store. And I could see tears well up in some of their eyes. When I was done telling the story, the woman at the counter said, Raymond, that's not a good story. That's a great story. And that's when I knew. That's when I knew I had to write this book. When I started writing in earnest, getting real serious, there's an old saying in writing. Writing a book is as easy as putting one word after another. It's that easy, and it's that hard. Well, I was having a hard time figuring out which word should go after the other. And I thought to myself, who might be able to give me some guidance, some help, in terms of writing the story? I don't know if you're familiar with James Bradley. But James Bradley is a #1 New York Times and national best-selling author of a number of different books. The best of which, in my opinion, is Flags of Our Fathers. Flags of Our Fathers is the story of the soldiers that raised the flag on Iwo Jima in the iconic photograph that has become the most reproduced photograph in the history of photography. James Bradley's father, John Bradley, was one of the soldiers who raised that flag on Iwo Jima. So I managed to make James Bradley's acquaintance. In some states, the way that I managed to meet him might be characterized under the law as stalking, but that's really unimportant. I managed to make his acquaintance, and we struck up a relationship. And at one point in time, we're having a long phone conversation, and I'm driving this poor guy crazy talking about the nuances of writing, about point of view, and voice, and all this other stuff. And James stops me abruptly. He says, Ray, just stop talking. He said, do you have a pen and paper? I said, sure. He said, write this down. H-I-S-T-O-R-Y. I said, history? He said, history, Ray. History. His story, Ray. Just tell the damn story. So I take James' advice, and I go to work. 2 years later, shortly before the book is about to be released and we're going to have a launch, publishers send out what's called a reader's edition. It's not for sale, it's not for general distribution, but it's for the author, editors, the publisher, perhaps critics, to take a look at the book before it's distributed to the public. When I got my first copy of that, I popped it into an envelope, sent it to James Bradley with a short note. And that note said, Dear James, I told the damn story. Ray. A couple of weeks later, after he had a chance to read the book, James sent me a nice email. And he offered to endorse the book. And as you can see here, James Bradley said Ray O'Connor abandoned his career to search for his namesake, a heroic B-17 pilot who died in World War II. What he found touches the heart and stirs the soul. I hope this story touches your heart and stirs your soul too. Thank you so much for listening. Questions about anything? The story behind the story, publishing business, writing. Yes? That's right.
So you told the story from example personal connection. Have you fallen in love with storytelling, and are you looking for other projects?
If you didn't hear in the back, the question was, have I, I would say I have a personal connection to the story, but have I fallen in love with storytelling and have any other projects? Yes. I love doing presentations. I love telling this story in particular, and stories in general. I do have another project that I've started. I'll just tell you a little bit about it. It has nothing to do with this story. In 2012, two friends and I went to Africa to climb Mount Kilimanjaro together. And the guide who took us up to Mount Kilimanjaro name is Protus Mayunga. He's a native of Tanzania, born and raised. He lives in the Catskills now with his 5 kids. And my friends and I were the second group of people that he ever took over to Africa and up to Mount Kilimanjaro as a guide. It was a brand new business he had. This gentleman has an extraordinary personal story. Like a lot of other kids in Africa, grew up dirt poor. He had a little sister that died of AIDS, a father who wasn't present, and the obstacles that he had to overcome to get where he is now. To live here, wonderful family, a good job, a side business, guiding people over to Africa to climb Mount Kilimanjaro. And one of the reasons he started that business was he realizes how lucky he is. And he absolutely worked hard for everything he's got. So I'd say it was more his personal fortitude and diligence rather than luck. But he recognizes how fortunate he is, and he uses this business to raise money, and goes back to the little school that he went to when he was a kid. Mud brick buildings, no windows, no books, no power, no running water. When I went over to Africa, I thought the height of our trip was going to be reaching the summit of Mount Kilimanjaro. It wasn't. The height of our trip was visiting this school. The friends who went with me are teachers. And it was a particular day, after we had been up and down Kilimanjaro, we were supposed to go on safari to one of the national parks in Tanzania. And Protus said, look, I'm going to have my cousin take you over there today. I've got some other business to take care of. Where are you going? So he tells us about this school. And we said, instead of going on safari, can we go with you? And these kids are so bright, particularly given what little resources they have. And they are so well behaved, and they are so happy that it has made me appreciate, and anyone who's ever visited over there, made you appreciate everything that we have here. But the story's really about him. Like I said, great guy. I've got the first chapter in the can. Now, a long ways to go. Probably a couple of years. We're going to want to take a trip to Africa or two to fill in all the gaps in the story. But thank you for asking. And I'm also, with substantial help, working on a screenplay for this story.
I have a question.
Sure.
You haven't, also in your book, you didn't talk much about your sister, your mom and Ray's daughter.
Yep.
I'm just curious, how does she feel about the book?
Yeah. You know, when I first came up with the notion to write the book, again, it was a couple of years after my dad had passed away. And my mom never wanted to talk about this story because she loved my father, her second husband, very much, and would never do anything to hurt his feelings. And, you know, if you believe in heaven, I figure my father must know by now that it was not named after his Uncle Ray. That I'm named after Raymond here. But my mother was never too crazy about me writing this story to begin with. She warmed up to the idea after a while. My sister always was intrigued with telling the story and was always very supportive of it and very happy with the final product. And that was one of my goals. I only had a couple of goals doing this project, and among them was I wanted to write a story that my mom and my sister and the rest of our family would be proud of, and a story that Raymond and his family would be proud of. I've met just about everybody in his family. There's a total of, 14 children, 36 grandchildren. But back to my sister for a second. I'll tell you a little story about her upbringing. My sister was raised in the same Hell's Kitchen tenement apartment in which my grandmother, my mother, and her 7 siblings were raised. There were only 3 rooms in this apartment. There was a kitchen, a living area, and a sleeping area. Not only did no one have their own bedroom, no one had their own bed. My sister slept sandwiched in between my grandmother and my mother from the time she was born until she was 9 years old, when my mom remarried to my dad. When they got married, my mom and dad, they moved into a 2-bedroom apartment. And the night that they got married, my father points to this extra bedroom and says to Anne Marie, "See that room over there? That's your room." And Anne Marie says, "What do I need a room for?" My father says, "Well, that's where you're going to sleep." "That's not how we sleep. We all sleep together." My dad says, "Not anymore." And that might seem kind of harsh at the time, but, if my father didn't draw the line there, I wouldn't be here to talk to you. And I'll tell you, one of the highlights for my sister in this project was we had a 2-night sellout audience at Northshire Bookstore in Saratoga Springs for the launch. And my sister came up. She lives down Long Island. And she came up for the launch. And I got a chance to introduce her and say a lot of nice things about my big sister. So it was a very special evening for her. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Really not easy to think what your job as CEO.
Oh, Ellen. I mentioned before, I do a lot of mountain climbing. And my mountain climbing friends and I, we have a core group, there's 4 of us. And one of the things we like to say to each other the most when we're considering where we should go next or the weather conditions is there's a fine line between bold and stupid. So when I'm trying to make this decision about whether or not to quit a really good job, my wife asked me at one point, what is writing a book pay? Exactly. So I said, well, it depends. Depends on what? Depends on if I sell any books. She says, oh, so nothing. I said, well, for starters. So I'm trying to make this decision. And I'm walking this fine line, and I'm not sure what side of the line I'm on, bold or stupid. But I'm glad you asked that question, because after I made the decision, and I still thought I was on the bold side, not the stupid side, but I wasn't sure. And I wouldn't be sure for a couple of years until the project was just about done, and I could see where it was going. But for any of you guys out there who are on that fence between bold and stupid, I came across a quote. It was a German philosopher by the name of Goethe. And it's not there. Okay. Well, I'm going to tell you what that quote is, because I remember it anyway. Goethe said, make sure I get it right. Whatever you can do, or dream you can, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. And once I made the commitment to do this, whether it was the diary, finding Keith Clinton, the flight records, or any of the, what I consider to be miraculous discoveries that were made in the course of writing this book, once I made that commitment, the genius, the magic, and the power just evolved on their own. I couldn't tell you. Let me give you one example. I mentioned about working on a screenplay. I'm in Ironton, Ohio. I've been invited out there in September of last year to do a presentation at a book signing. Although it's still a very depressed Rust Belt town, they have a beautiful library. Ironton is the county seat for Lawrence County, and the county built this great facility. So I do my presentation, so much of the one I've done for you guys today. We go to question and answer. And a woman in the audience says, I've read your book. I think it's a great story. I think it would make even a better movie. And I said to her, I said, I get that question almost every time I do a presentation someplace. Will this thing ever be a movie? So then another woman in the audience says, Mickey Fisher is a guy you should talk to. And another guy in the audience says, yeah, Mickey Fisher's a guy you got to meet. So I said, look, I got to plead ignorance here. Who's Mickey Fisher? There's been a television show on CBS the last 2 seasons called Extant. E-X-T-A-N-T. Has anybody seen it? Stars Halle Berry. And the executive producer of that television show is Steven Spielberg. I know everybody's heard of Steven Spielberg. The guy who actually writes and produces that show is Mickey Fisher. Mickey Fisher entered a contest that was held by Amblin Studios, Steven Spielberg's production company, about 3 years ago. Anybody who wanted to submit a screenplay to Steven Spielberg could do so. And he was going to pick one person out of obscurity and either make a television show or a film out of their work. So Mickey Fisher submitted a screenplay. And out of the more than 1,500 screenplays that were submitted, Mickey Fisher is picked by Steven Spielberg. Steven Spielberg called him on his birthday and said, "You're the winner. CBS has bought your story, and we're going to get a 13-episode run." This was a couple of years ago. Mickey Fisher is from Ironton, Ohio, the same depressed city in Ohio that Clarence Raymond Stevenson is from. So I get home from Ohio, and I post on the book website, the book's Facebook page, Twitter, and LinkedIn. I tell a little story about being in Ironton and how people were telling me I got to meet Mickey Fisher. I put up a picture of Mickey Fisher, a picture of me at a book signing, and a picture of the cover of the book. And I asked if anyone would be kind enough to introduce me to Mickey Fisher, I would appreciate it. 2 days later, I get an email from Mickey Fisher out in Hollywood. And he says, "Hi, Ray. This is Mickey Fisher. Nice to meet you, even if just by email. I've got a number of messages through social media from people telling me I should talk to you about your story. But this morning, my mom called, and my mom said I have to talk to you. And I always do what my mom tells me to do." So we swapped a couple of emails that day. He downloaded the e-version of the book, said he was going to read it, and he said, "I'm really busy right now, but this was in October. He said, after the holidays, after the first of the year, I'll get in touch with you." 3 hours after I got his first email, I get an email from his mom. "Hi, Ray, this is Debbie Fisher. I'm Mickey Fisher's mom. Has he called you yet?" And I said, "As a matter of fact, Mrs. Fisher," I said, "Mickey sent me an email this morning, and he told me he always does what his mom tells him to do. He's a good boy. You raise him right." Fast forward, we get past the holidays. I don't get an email. I don't get a phone call. I get nothing from Mickey Fisher. So I figured I'm being left at the altar. So about 3 weeks ago, I sent something to Mickey Fisher. I sent a message to his mom and said, "Do you mind sharing Mickey's home address with me?" "Certainly not. Here's his address." When I was in Ironton, a regional newspaper called the Tribune had done a nice cover story about the book and about my presentation, photographs a little bit. I grabbed a half a dozen of those newspapers before I left Ohio. So I popped one in an envelope with a brief note and also a praise page. And I sent it to Mickey Fisher at his home about 3 weeks ago. And so what I sent him in terms of praise was, on the back of the book, there's everything from James Bradley's quote to some others praising the book. So I put those on a sheet of paper, except I added one more. Because after Debbie Fisher, his mom, had read the book, she sent me another email. "It's a beautiful story, Ray. It'll make a great movie someday." So I added to the bottom of that praise page, "It's a beautiful story, Ray. It'll make a great movie someday. Debbie Fisher, Mickey's mom." So I popped the newspaper, the note, and that page in one envelope, and I fired off to Los Angeles. Let's see, it would be 2 weeks ago today. I get an email from Mickey Fisher. "Ray, what are you doing Sunday afternoon at 2 o'clock? I said, "I think I'm going to be sitting by my phone waiting for your call." So he called me just a week ago Sunday. We have an hour-long conversation. We're talking about screenwriting, screenplay, making some connections to possibly turn this into a movie. So I'm taking a long-winded way to answer your question. Yes, it was a very difficult decision to make. It's looking more and more like I was bold and not stupid in terms of making that move. But I consider it simply to be miraculous. All the things, all the good fortune that has come my way because I made a very difficult decision and pretty much followed my heart instead of my head. The conservative banker in me told me I was crazy, but the impetuous child that I've always been, and that most men are, said to go for it. Any questions?
I have a few things.
Sure.
Just a few. I want to make a comment to all of you who have not yet read the book. That, of course, wouldn't be anybody in our class, so you know all that. Just because you know the plot, it doesn't matter. Believe me, the narrative's great. Knowing the plot maybe even enhances the experience of reading the book. A couple of things also from those of you who are writers. Courage is a major quality, I think, sometimes for writers to have. Ray O'Connor has this. I think it's also interesting how we met. I had a former student who emailed me, told me about the book, and asked if I would get Ray O'Connor for the Writers Project, recommended him. So I said, get enough of the book, didn't read it in full yet, to see what it was, and asked him. Very graciously agreed. Didn't ask for money or anything like that. And then I was able to finally meet Ray at an author's book fair at the Clifton Park Library, which was just nice before it was, but he'd already agreed to come. I just think, where these things happen is always very interesting. And all the little narratives that Ray's giving you, how different things intertwine in life. People meet in those notes. It's an interesting thing. It's a mystery to me.
You know, as much as I've given away on the story, the height of the story is not about Raymond's passing. I think most people, as they get into the story, before they even get to that part, I think they anticipate something bad might happen. But the real ending and the pinnacle of the story, which I will not give away, never have, has to do with what I think a lot of good stories are about, and that's redemption for someone, and how that happens. By the way, people usually ask me, how can I get the book? If you like ebooks, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, iTunes, yeah, it's everywhere you get an ebook. For those who like audiobooks, I think sometime within the next month the audiobook is going to be completed. I narrate it, and it's going through some final editing work. And if someone else had narrated it, it'd probably be done already, but trying to find the time, the hours and hours to sit in a 10-foot by 10-foot booth and read a book out loud and try to maintain your voice is pretty challenging. Let's see, hardcover and softcover books, again, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. I'm a huge fan of independent bookstores. I live in Northshire. We're lucky to have an independent bookstore, or any bookstore, in Saratoga Springs. I also brought some books. If you want to get a book, that's fine. If you don't want a book, that's fine too. And usually I do presentations like this, especially for students. Hardcover retails for $29.95. The soft for $19.95. $15 and $20 a cover, a soft cover or a hardcover today. I basically take my cut out of it because the most important thing to me. I mentioned other goals before about writing a story that Raymond's family and my family would be proud of. My other goal is to tell this story to as many people who are willing to listen to it or to read it. So I'm not. I'll make my money when the movies make, I guess. Any other questions, comments? Yes.
Did you always
No. You know, it took me a few years to write the book. And as notions would come to mind, I'd write them down. People would tell me, oh, you can't use that title, it's too long. I'll tell you, if you ever do any writing, a lot of the advice that you get from people who have written, publishers, editors, they'll give you good advice, but the best piece of advice I got was from an author by the name of Adam Braver. Adam Braver writes historic fiction. He's also a professor at, a college in Providence, Rhode Island. Not Brown, Roger Williams. And he was an author in residence at Skidmore for the New York State Summer Writers Institute. And if you're serious about your writing and you want to learn a lot in a hurry, go to the New York State Summer Writers Institute for a couple of weeks. It's hosted at Skidmore every year. The program's been around for about 30 years. But you get to hang around with people prize-winning authors. And with this piece of advice that Adam Braver gave, I was thinking about making some dramatic changes to the manuscript I had at the time. And I said, geez, Adam, after listening to what some other authors said, participants in this program, a lot of smart people, some students who had their Masters in Fine Arts, I think I kind of gut this thing. And he said, Ray, don't do that. You tell the story the way that you think it ought to be told. Here's the way it's going to go. Half the people are going to think that it stinks. The other half are going to think that you're a genius. So, whether it's the title or any other component, to a great extent, you got to trust your gut. Tell a story. Hey, I don't care if it's a book, an essay, an article. Tell it the way you think it ought to be told. Title it the way you think it ought to be titled. And I probably went through a half a dozen, maybe more, prospective titles.